In December of 1988, in the historic city of Tours, France, a young woman was sitting in her friend's house having a quiet cup of coffee. The atmosphere was calm, and they were chatting about ordinary things, just passing the time on a regular afternoon. At some point during their conversation, the young woman excused herself to go use the bathroom. She walked down the short hallway, stepped inside the bathroom, and closed the door behind her. As she went to use the toilet, she reached down to lift the lid, and as she did, she noticed something highly unusual. Resting at the very bottom of the toilet bowl, floating in the clear water, were two small, glittering gold objects. At first glance, they looked like tiny decorative beads or perhaps broken pieces of expensive jewelry that had been accidentally dropped and flushed. She was curious, so she leaned down much closer to the bowl, squinting her eyes to get a better look through the water, and then in an instant, her curiosity turned to absolute horror as she realized what they actually were. They were not beads, and they were not pieces of jewelry. They were two gold dental crowns, still attached to fragments of human bone. To understand how those gold dental crowns ended up in that toilet bowl and the gruesome tragedy they revealed, we have to go back to the night of December 11th, 1988. On that cold winter evening, a 38-year-old woman named Francois Gandrron stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom of a popular nightclub in Tours. She was carefully touching up her red lipstick, adjusting her hair, and looking at her reflection. Right next to her, washing her hands at the sink, was her lifelong best friend, Sylvie Rivero. These two women had been inseparable for as long as anyone could remember. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, and shared almost every major milestone in their lives. Now, in their late 30s, both of them were divorced and trying to navigate the challenges of single life. Recently, Francois's 19-year-old son had moved out of her apartment to join the military, which left Francois living completely on her own for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Instead of feeling lonely, Francois felt a sudden, powerful sense of freedom. She wanted to make the most of her independence, which meant she was going out almost every single night, and she always wanted Sylvie by her side. But even though they were best friends, they were very different people. Francois was incredibly outgoing, bubbly, and natural around others. She had a massive circle of friends and could start a conversation with absolutely anyone. Sylvie, on the other hand, was deeply introverted, quiet, and reserved. She tended to keep to herself and often found social situations exhausting. Because of this, Francois was always the driving force in their friendship, constantly nudging Sylvie to get out of her comfort zone, to put on a nice outfit, and to join her for late nights at the local clubs. Usually, Sylvie went along with it, even if she was reluctant, but on this particular night, the dynamic between them suddenly shifted. As they stood in the nightclub bathroom, it was Francois who turned to Sylvie and announced that she wanted to leave and go home immediately. She explained that she was feeling incredibly uncomfortable around the two men they were sitting with, Michel and Luc. Michel and Luc were local businessmen who owned a discount clothing store in town, and they were regular acquaintances of the two women. They had gone out as a group many times before without any issues, but tonight, Francois told Sylvie that she was getting a very strange, unsettling vibe from both of them. She could not put her finger on exactly what it was, but her intuition was telling her that something was off and she wanted to get away from them. Sylvie was visibly disappointed by this. Despite her quiet nature, she had actually been enjoying herself and wanted to stay out longer. She tried to reason with Francois, pointing out that Michel and Luc were their friends and that nothing bad had ever happened when they hung out. She asked Francois what had suddenly changed, but Francois refused to argue. She simply insisted that her gut was telling her to leave and she was going to listen to it. A few minutes later, Francois and Sylvie walked back out to the main area of the nightclub. Michel and Luc were still sitting at their table. There was a receipt lying on the wood, and Michel was in the middle of sliding his leather wallet back into his coat pocket, having just paid for their drinks. As the women approached, Michel looked up, smiled, and asked them if they were ready to move on to the next club down the street. Francois kept a polite but distant smile on her face. She reached for her heavy winter coat and explained that she was actually going to head home for the night. She fabricated a quick excuse, telling the men that her boyfriend was likely already waiting for her at her apartment, and she did not want to keep him waiting in the cold. The men were clearly surprised by this sudden departure, and Michel seemed slightly offended. He looked at her suspiciously and asked if everything was truly okay, questioning if her boyfriend was the real reason she was leaving so early. Francois maintained her polite demeanor, reassuring him that everything was perfectly fine and that she simply had to get some rest. She could tell they did not believe her, but she did not care. She turned to Sylvie, gave her a warm, tight hug, said a quick goodbye to the men, and walked briskly out of the club. Once she stepped onto the street, she immediately hailed a passing taxi, got inside, and watched the neon lights of the club disappear into the distance, feeling a sense of relief. The following morning, Monday, December 12th, Francois woke up in her own bed to the familiar sounds of her boyfriend, Yves Marda, moving around the bedroom. She rolled over, glanced at the clock on her nightstand, and saw that it was 8 o'clock. She sat up and looked at Yves, who was busy getting dressed for his workday. When she spoke to him, his response was cold, quiet, and sharp. She knew exactly why he was angry. When she had returned home late the night before, they had gotten into a massive argument. Yves had been waiting at her apartment for hours, expecting them to spend a quiet evening together. Francois' habit of staying out late with her friends, especially her male acquaintances, had become a major point of contention in their relationship. Yves worked demanding hours during the day, meaning the evenings were the only time they could reasonably see each other. But Francois often prioritized her social life, coming home so late that it was impossible for them to spend any real time together. Francois realized she needed to make amends. She looked at Yves and softly asked if he would like to come over to her apartment that evening after he finished his shift. She promised him that she would be home waiting for him and that they would cook a nice dinner together and spend a quiet, peaceful night alone without any interruptions or plans to go out. Hearing this, Yves' shoulders relaxed and the tension in his face faded. He turned to her, smiled, and told her that he would really love that. The dark mood in the room instantly vanished. As Yves finished tying his shoes, he asked Francois what her plans were for the rest of the day. She explained that she had scheduled a local handyman named Christian Marrow to come by her apartment later that morning. Christian was supposed to deliver and put up some new wallpaper in her bedroom, which meant she would likely be staying inside all day while he worked. Yves nodded, gave her a warm kiss goodbye, and left the apartment for work. Once he was gone, Francois got out of bed, wrapped herself in a warm bathrobe, and walked into the kitchen. She fed her cat, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and decided that a hot bath would be the perfect way to cure her lingering headache from the night before. She turned on the tap, let the tub fill with warm water, and stepped inside, closing her eyes and enjoying the quiet. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Tuesday, December 13th, a janitor at the Treso Hospital in Tours was carrying a heavy plastic bag of garbage out to the large dumpsters in the back parking lot. The hospital grounds were quiet, with only a few cars parked in the stalls. As he walked across the asphalt, his eyes caught sight of something unusual. Sitting directly on a narrow strip of green grass in the middle of the parking lot were two bright blue plastic trash bags. The hospital strictly used gray trash bags for all of its waste, so the janitor knew immediately that these blue bags did not belong to the hospital. They had to have been left by an outsider. The janitor walked over to the bags to investigate. They looked heavy and bulged with some sort of bulky contents, but he could not determine what was inside. Curious, he bent down, grabbed the plastic tie of the first bag and pulled it open. He peered inside, and what he saw made his heart freeze. He gasped, stumbled backward, dropped his own trash, and ran as fast as his legs could carry him back into the hospital lobby, screaming for someone to contact the police immediately. By noon, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department arrived at the hospital parking lot. He was the lead investigator on duty and the first official to arrive at the scene. The terrified janitor met him near the entrance and led him over to the grassy island where the blue bags sat. Barbier knelt on the cold ground and carefully opened the first bag. Inside, he found two severed human arms and the lower sections of two human legs. He then turned to the second bag, opening it with a sense of dread. This bag contained the torso of a woman, but as Barbier examined the remains, he realized that several major parts of the body were missing. There was no pelvis, there were no thighs, and there was no head. Barbier turned to the janitor and asked him precisely when he had first noticed the bags. The janitor explained that he had seen them just before 11 o'clock. He was absolutely positive they had not been there when he had done his previous trash run at 9 o'clock that morning. This meant that the killer had brazenly driven into a busy, active hospital parking lot in broad daylight, sometime between 9 and 11 in the morning, and dumped the bags on the grass. Barbier stood up, looking around the area. He noticed that a local medical school was located just down the street. For a split second, he wondered if this might be a highly inappropriate, macabre prank played by medical students who had somehow managed to steal a cadaver from the university's research facility or the hospital morgue. But Barbier quickly dismissed the thought. It was hard to believe that students would go to such extreme, criminal lengths just for a joke. The far more realistic and far more horrifying explanation was that this woman had been murdered, and her killer had dismembered her body to make it easier to transport and discard. The primary obstacle for Barbier and his team was identification. Without a head and with so many parts missing, they had no face, no dental records, and no immediate way to know who this woman was. And if they could not identify the victim, finding her killer would be an almost impossible task. Barbier hoped that the forensics team would find some fingerprints on the plastic bags, but he knew they were starting the investigation with very few clues. 4 days later, on December 17th, Barbier sat at his desk, frustratedly reading through the initial autopsy report. The investigation had hit a complete standstill. Since the discovery of the bags at the hospital, more body parts matching the victim had been found discarded behind a discount clothing store in a commercial area of Tours, but the head was still entirely missing. The police had issued a public appeal for information, but no one had reported any women missing that matched the physical description of the remains, and no one had come forward with any leads. To make matters worse, the forensics team had been unable to lift any usable fingerprints from the blue plastic bags. Barbier turned back to the autopsy report, searching for any detail that might help. The medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the National Criminal Database, but there was no match. However, the autopsy did reveal a few crucial facts. The victim had died very recently, likely on Monday, December 12th, just one day before the first remains were found. The cause of death was determined to be massive hemorrhaging from two deep, clean cuts on her wrists. Additionally, toxicology reports showed a high concentration of a potent anti-anxiety drug in her system, suggesting she had been heavily sedated before her wrists were cut. This detail puzzled Barbier. The act of drugging someone and letting them quietly bleed to death in a controlled manner seemed strangely gentle, almost clinical when compared to the extreme, chaotic violence of hacking the body into pieces afterward. Barbier began to wonder if this contrast pointed to the nature of the killer. Perhaps the killer was physically small or weak, unable to overpower the victim in a physical fight. Drugging her would eliminate the risk of a struggle. And if the killer was physically incapable of moving a heavy, intact human body out of a building, dismembering it would be a logical necessity, allowing them to carry the parts away in ordinary trash bags without attracting attention. As Barbier was pondering these theories, his desk telephone rang. He picked it up and was greeted by the voice of a woman. She did not state her name and spoke in a rapid, hushed tone. She told Barbier that she had been reading the newspaper coverage about the dismembered body. She said she believed the victim was a woman named Francois Gandrron, who lived in the Lavallee Violet apartment complex. Before Barbier could ask any questions, the woman abruptly hung up, leaving him with a name and an address. 30 minutes later, Barbier arrived at the Lavallee Violet apartment complex. He walked through the quiet ground floor hallway, hoping this lead would yield results. Since he did not have an apartment number, he knocked on the door of a nearby resident to ask if they knew Francois. An elderly neighbor answered, nodded, and pointed to a door further down the hall, confirming that Francois lived there. The neighbor then added a worrying detail. He had not seen Francois or any visitors entering or leaving her apartment for several days, and he was getting concerned because he could hear her cat meowing continuously from inside. Barbier walked to Francois's door and knocked loudly. There was no answer, but he could clearly hear the faint, distressed meows of a cat from the other side of the wood. Barbier returned to his police cruiser and called for a forensics team to assist him with forced entry. Once the team arrived, they used a battering ram to break open the door. Barbier stepped into the quiet apartment, standing in the living room. Everything looked neat and tidy, but when he walked into the kitchen, he noticed something out of place. On the floor lay a shattered ceramic plate with dried-up food scattered around the broken pieces. It looked as though a meal had been dropped or thrown in anger. However, there was no blood anywhere in the kitchen, and nothing else in the apartment appeared to have been disturbed or stolen. In the bedroom, Barbier found several unopened rolls of wallpaper sitting on a small stool, indicating that a home improvement project had been planned but never started. He ordered the forensics team to feed the hungry cat and then begin a thorough search of the apartment for fingerprints and any trace evidence that could help identify the resident or explain what had happened. As the team got to work, Barbier walked over to the front window and looked down at the street. He noticed a young man standing on the opposite sidewalk, staring intently at the apartment window. The moment the young man realized Barbier was looking back at him, he froze, his expression turning to one of pure panic. He immediately turned and began walking away down the street at a very fast pace. Barbier threw open the window, shouted for the man to halt, and ran down the stairs to intercept him. An hour later, Barbier sat across from the young man in an interrogation room at the Tours police station. The man's name was Yves Marta, and he confirmed that he was Francois' boyfriend. He explained that he had only come to the building to see if Francois was home, as he had not heard from her in 5 days. When he saw the police presence, he had panicked, fearing the worst. He insisted he had no idea she was missing and stated that the last time he had seen her was on the morning of Monday, December 12th. The mention of December 12th immediately set off alarm bells for Barbier, as that was the estimated date of the murder. He asked Yves to describe his movements on that day in detail. Yves explained that he had woken up at Francois' apartment around 8 in the morning on the 12th. They had resolved their argument from the night before, and Francois had promised to stay home that evening so they could cook dinner together. Yves said he left for his job and worked his entire shift. He returned to Francois' apartment around 6 in the evening, but she was not there. He let himself in with his key and decided to wait for her, making himself a plate of food. By 8 o'clock, she still had not returned. Then, the kitchen phone rang. Yves answered it. A woman's voice on the other end, claiming to be a friend of Francois, told him that Francois had decided to go out of town for the weekend with some other friends and would not be coming back that night. Yves told Barbier that he was so furious at being stood up again that he threw his plate of food onto the floor, shattering it, and then left the apartment to spend the night at his mother's house. Barbier listened to the story, noting that the broken plate in the kitchen matched Eve's account perfectly. But he also recognized that Eve had a volatile temper. Could he have confronted Francois and killed her in a fit of rage? Barbier took down the contact information for Eve's mother to verify his alibi and asked if anyone else was expected at the apartment that day. Eve mentioned the handyman, Christian Marot, who was supposed to hang wallpaper. The next day, December 18th, Barbier visited Christian Marot. The young handyman confirmed that he had gone to Francois' apartment on the morning of December 12th, arriving around 10 o'clock. He said Francois had answered the door in her bathrobe, looking as though she had just taken a bath. Christian stated that his visit lasted less than a minute. He had simply dropped off the wallpaper rolls and told her he would return another day to do the installation. He insisted she seemed perfectly fine and happy when he saw her. Barbier verified Christian's alibi for the rest of the day, which was supported by several witnesses who had seen him working at other locations in Tours. Yves Martin's alibi was also confirmed by his mother and his employer, ruling both men out as suspects. On December 19th, the forensics team confirmed that fingerprints recovered from Francois' apartment matched the severed hands found in the trash bags. Francois Gandrron was officially identified as the victim, but the identity of the killer remained a mystery. Barbier was determined to find the woman who had called Francois' apartment on the night of the murder. That call was clearly a deliberate attempt to keep Eve from searching for Francois, giving the killer time to dispose of the remains. But tracing the call was taking time due to telephone company protocols. Just then, Barbier received another phone call at the station from a woman claiming to have information. She told Barbier that Francois had been close friends with two men named Michel and Luc, who ran a discount clothing store. She claimed these men were involved in drug trafficking and that Francois had discovered their activities and threatened to go to the police. The caller stated that Michel and Luc had planned to murder Francois by drugging her, bleeding her in a bathtub, and disassembling her body to prevent identification. The specificity of these details, which matched the unpublished autopsy findings, convinced Barbier that the caller had direct knowledge of the crime. On the morning of December 20th, Barbier and a team of officers arrested Michel and Luc at their clothing store. They also brought in Sylvie Rivero, Francois' best friend, for questioning. Believing she could shed light on the group's dynamics, Barbier interviewed Sylvie first. She appeared terrified and began to weep, claiming she had been too scared to go to the police. She confirmed that Michel and Luc were drug dealers and had threatened to kill Francois if she exposed them. She painted a picture of two dangerous men capable of extreme violence. Barbier then interviewed Michel, showing him the horrific photos of the recovered body parts. Michel went pale, but his reaction was one of genuine shock and grief. He wept openly, insisting that Francois was a dear friend and that he had nothing to do with her death. His denial felt incredibly authentic, causing Barbier to question the narrative Sylvie had provided. The breakthrough came when another detective informed Barbier of an interview with a woman named Yvette, an acquaintance of both Francois and Sylvie. Yvette revealed that her young daughter had visited Sylvie's apartment a few days after Francois disappeared. While using the bathroom, the girl had spotted two gold dental crowns floating in the toilet bowl. Yvette knew Francois had gold crowns and, upon hearing about the murder, realized the connection. Barbier immediately secured a search warrant for Sylvie's apartment. The forensics team sprayed Sylvie's bathtub with chemicals that detect hidden blood. The tub glowed brilliantly, revealing that a large amount of blood had been present, despite being scrubbed clean. Investigators also found Francois' missing jewelry hidden in a box in Sylvie's closet. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Sylvie Rivero's lies fell apart and she confessed to the murder. She admitted that she had grown deeply jealous and resentful of Francois' outgoing personality, her popularity with men, and her vibrant life. This jealousy had turned into a toxic hatred. On the morning of December 12th, after the handyman had left, Sylvie had visited Francois and invited her back to her own apartment. There, she drugged Francois' tea with heavy sedatives. Once Francois was unconscious, Sylvie put her in the bathtub and drowned her. She then dismembered the body to make it easier to transport, throwing the head into the Loire River and attempting to flush the gold dental crowns down the toilet. She had then called Francois' apartment to lie to Eve, and had later tried to frame Michel and Luc by feeding false details to her friend Yvette, hoping she would pass them to the police. Sylvia Riorigo was charged with premeditated murder on December 21, 1988. In 1991, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The tragic case left Francois' family devastated, her head was never recovered, and the community was left to grapple with how a lifelong friendship could end in such unspeakable horror. To fully understand how such a deep bond of friendship could disintegrate into such a brutal crime, the investigators had to look closer at the history of the two women. They had grown up in the post-war era of central France, a time when neighbors relied on each other and children played in the streets until dusk. Francois and Sylvie had been next-door neighbors, their families sharing meals and celebrating holidays together. Francois had always been the golden child of the neighborhood, the one who excelled in school, who was chosen for theater plays, and who naturally commanded the attention of every room she walked into. Sylvie, by contrast, had always felt like a shadow. She was the quiet observer, the one who sat in the background, while Francois laughed and charmed the people around them. As they grew older, their paths seemed to diverge, yet they remained anchored to one another. Francois married young, had a son, and built a home filled with music and laughter. Sylvie also married, but her relationship was fraught with quiet tension and eventual isolation. When both of their marriages ended in divorce within a few years of each other, it seemed like a natural alignment of their fates. They returned to the familiar patterns of their youth, spending almost every evening together. But while Francois saw her newly single status as an opportunity to reinvent herself and explore the world, Sylvie felt increasingly trapped by her own social anxieties and limitations. Every night they went out, Sylvie watched Francois turn heads and make effortless connections. She watched as men bought Francois drinks and listened intently to her stories. Sylvie sat beside her, feeling invisible, her quietness interpreted as aloofness or disinterest. Over time, a quiet, toxic resentment began to take root in Sylvie's mind. She began to believe that Francois was intentionally showing off, that her best friend's vibrant energy was a deliberate attempt to make Sylvie look small and insignificant. Every laugh, every shared joke, and every gesture of affection from Francois began to feel like a subtle insult to Sylvie. By the winter of 1988, this resentment had reached a boiling point. The decision of Francois' son to move out of the apartment had given Francois even more freedom, and she was eager to spend even more time out on the town. For Sylvie, the demands of the friendship had become suffocating. She felt compelled to accompany Francois every night, yet every night was a painful reminder of her own perceived failures and loneliness. She began to obsess over the idea that Francois was the source of her unhappiness. If Francois were not there to cast her in a shadow, Sylvie believed, she would finally be able to step into the light and be noticed. The plan to murder Francois was not a sudden, impulsive act of rage. The investigation revealed that Sylvie had been contemplating the crime for weeks. She had carefully researched the effects of the anti-anxiety medications she had been prescribed, calculating the exact dosage required to render an adult woman helpless without immediately causing a fatal overdose. She wanted Francois to be conscious enough to walk to her apartment, but too weak to resist once they arrived. She had also planned the method of dismemberment, purchasing the heavy plastic bags and clearing her calendar for the days following the planned date to ensure she would have uninterrupted time to clean her apartment. The night of December 11th was the final catalyst. When Francois had insisted on leaving the club because she felt uncomfortable around Michelle and Luc, Sylvie had felt a surge of intense frustration. She had finally been enjoying herself, feeling a rare moment of connection with the group, but once again, Francois had dictated the terms of their evening, forcing everyone to adapt to her whims. In Sylvie's mind, this was the ultimate proof of Francois' selfishness. As she watched Francois drive away in the taxi, Sylvie decided that the following morning would be the time to act. On Monday morning, after knowing that Eve Marta had gone to work, Sylvie made her way to Francois' apartment building. She waited nearby until she saw the handyman, Christian Marrow, leave the premises. She knew that Francois would be alone, relaxed, and unsuspecting. When she knocked on the door, Francois had welcomed her with open arms, completely unaware that her lifelong friend had a pocket full of lethal sedatives and a mind consumed by hatred. The walk back to Sylvie's apartment was short, but for Sylvie, it must have felt like a march toward a dark, inevitable destination. She kept her conversation light and cheerful, playing the role of the supportive, loving friend. Francois, tired from the late night and the argument with Eve, was grateful for the company and the offer of a warm cup of tea. She sat at Sylvie's kitchen table, talking about her plans for her apartment and her hopes for her relationship with Eve. As Francois drank the tea, the crushed medication began to flood her system. The first sign was a sudden heaviness in her eyelids, followed by a slurring of her words. She laughed it off at first, attributing it to her hangover and fatigue. But within minutes, she could no longer keep her head upright. Her arms felt like lead, and her vision began to fade into a dark haze. She looked at Sylvie, perhaps seeking help, but she would have found only a cold, unyielding stare. The physical effort required for Sylvie to carry Francois into the bathroom and lift her into the tub was immense. Sylvie was not a large woman, and Francois was a full-grown adult. But the adrenaline of the moment, combined with her cold determination, allowed her to complete the task. She filled the tub with water and held Francois' head beneath the surface until the faint struggle ceased. Francois died in the quiet of that bathroom, betrayed by the person she trusted most in the world. The dismemberment of the body was a long, grueling process that took several hours. Sylvie worked methodically, using her knowledge of basic anatomy to separate the limbs from the torso. She washed the blood down the drain continuously, trying to prevent any staining of the porcelain or the tiles. But despite her efforts, Microscopic particles of blood remained trapped in the grout and the plumbing, waiting for the forensic investigators to find them days later. The disposal of the head was the most calculated part of the cover-up. Sylvie knew that without a head, the police would have no teeth to match to dental records and no face to show to the public. She took the head to the Loire River, a deep and fast-flowing waterway that ran through the region. She threw the remains into the dark water, believing that they would be carried away to the sea or buried in the silt of the riverbed, never to be found. And indeed, despite extensive search efforts by police divers in the weeks following her confession, the river kept its secret. The gold dental crowns were a small detail that Sylvie had overlooked. She had managed to extract them from the jaw, but in her haste to clean up the apartment before her scheduled call to Eve, she had simply thrown them into the toilet bowl and flushed. She assumed they had gone down the drain with the rest of the waste. She did not realize that the heavy metal would sink to the bottom of the trap, remaining there as a silent, glittering accusation. The phone call to Eve Marta was a chilling demonstration of Sylvie's ability to manipulate those around her. She had waited near Francois' apartment, knowing Eve's routine. When she saw his car pull up, she walked to a nearby payphone and dialed the number. She spoke in a disguised voice, delivering the lie about Francois leaving town with friends. She knew Eve's temper, and she correctly predicted that the news would drive him away in anger, giving her several days of silence before anyone began to question Francois' absence. She had also attempted to create a complex web of misdirection by involving Michel and Luc. She knew that the two men had a reputation in the local community for engaging in shady business practices, and she decided to exploit this to her advantage. She began dropping subtle hints to her friends and acquaintances, suggesting that Francois had gotten herself into deep trouble with the business partners. She painted a picture of Francois as a victim of a dangerous criminal underworld, hoping that when the body was inevitably found, the police would focus their attention entirely on the discount clothing store and its owners. But she had underestimated the diligence of Chief Inspector Barbier and his team. Barbier was a seasoned detective who had seen many cover-ups in his career. He was trained to look past the obvious narratives and focus on the physical evidence. When Michel's reaction during the interrogation proved to be genuine, Barbier immediately knew that the story of the drug dealers was a fabrication. He began to look for the source of the rumors, and all roads led back to Sylvie. The interview with Yvette was the turning point. Yvette had been hesitant to come forward at first, torn between her loyalty to her friend Sylvie and her growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. But when her daughter described the gold crowns in the toilet, Yvette knew she could no longer remain silent. She walked into the police station and delivered the piece of information that would unlock the entire mystery. The search of Sylvie's apartment was a somber affair. The forensic investigators worked in silence, their equipment humming as they swept the rooms for evidence. When the luminol spray reacted with the bathtub, illuminating the dark room with a bright blue glow, there was a collective intake of breath. The tub was covered in a map of light, revealing the scale of the horror that had taken place within its walls. The discovery of Francois' jewelry in Sylvie's closet was the final nail in the coffin. The items were distinctive, including a gold necklace that Francois wore almost every day. Sylvie had kept them, perhaps as trophies of her crime, or perhaps out of a simple, greedy desire to possess the things that had once belonged to the friend she so deeply envied. When Sylvie was brought back into the interrogation room and shown the photographs of the glowing bathtub and the jewelry, her composed facade completely shattered. She realized that her elaborate plan had failed and that she was facing a lifetime behind bars. She began to speak, her voice trembling as she described the steps she had taken to end her friend's life. The detectives listened in silence, horrified by the cold, calculated nature of the crime. The trial of Sylvia Riorigo in 1991 was one of the most highly publicized events in the history of Tours. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, local residents, and the families of the victim and the accused. The prosecution presented the evidence with clinical precision, laying out the timeline of the murder and the cover-up. The defense attempted to argue that Sylvie was a victim of psychological abuse and control by Francois, claiming that Francois' dominant personality had driven Sylvie to a state of temporary insanity. But the jury did not accept this narrative. They saw the premeditation, the cold execution, and the ruthless attempt to frame innocent men. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder, and the sentence of life in prison was met with a sense of relief by the community. But for those who had known Francois, there was no real sense of closure. Her son, who had left home to build a life of his own, was left with a permanent void that could never be filled. He had lost his mother, and he had lost the woman he had once considered an aunt. Eve Marta was also deeply affected by the tragedy. He was haunted by the memory of his final conversation with Francois and the realization that his anger had played right into the hands of her killer. He had spent the years following the murder trying to understand how he could have been so blind to the danger that was lurking so close to them. The Lavalette Violet apartment complex returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of the crime lingered in the hallways. The neighbor who had heard the cat meowing often looked at the silent door, remembering the vibrant woman who had once lived there. The cat was eventually adopted by a loving family, a small comfort in a story filled with so much darkness. The Loire River continued to flow through the city of Tours, its waters carrying the secrets of that December morning. The search for Francois's head was eventually called off, leaving her final resting place incomplete. Her family erected a modest memorial in the local cemetery, a place where they could gather to remember her laughter, her warmth, and the brief, bright life she had lived before it was so cruelly cut short. The case of Francois Gandrron and Sylvie Rivero remains a classic example of the dark undercurrents that can exist within the most intimate relationships. It is a story of how jealousy, if left to fester, can turn into a destructive force that ruins the lives of everyone it touches. And it is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people in our lives are not the strangers we fear in the dark, but the friends we welcome into our homes with a smile. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.